Hi, everyone. Welcome to this ISE webinar. This is going to be the first in a series of makeup pre-conference workshops from ISE this past summer. We wanted to spare people being on Zoom for multiple days in a row as much as possible. So we're spreading these out across the year. So be on the lookout for additional calls. There's some other really interesting ones coming up. They'll be in the newsletter, and you can also find them on Twitter at ISE NAC. So today, very excited to learn more about Google Earth Engine. We have three folks here with us, KELVIN FONG, who is at Yale University's School of the Environment. We also have Peter James and Hari IYER from Harvard University. And so they'll be leading us through this. Originally, this was, I believe, a 4-hour workshop, and they'll be talking to us in 1 hour. So keep that in mind, everyone. This will be likely fast and furious, but we will make notes available in addition to the webinar. So hopefully you can come back and play with this more. So with that, I will hand it over to you guys. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Dr. Casey. I'll just get right into it. My name is KELVIN FONG, and today I'll be joined by Hari as well as Peter. So I am going to be in charge of the introduction before Hari talks a little bit about exploring Google Earth Engine data. I'll then come back and talk about calculating area level statistics before Peter concludes with implications of using Google Earth Engine. And slides, as Jones mentioned, the slides and code will be available for download. And so I'll provide a link at the end of this introduction part. So what's the motivation for us hosting this initially workshop, now webinar? Increasingly, we as environmental epidemiologists are using and working with large amounts of spatial temporal data. And so are the methods that we use, are they sufficient and suitable for the analysis or the future analysis that we're doing, given that there are now more and more spatial temporal data, especially from remote sensing? And what are some of the tools that could help us in retrieving and processing these large spatial temporal data? In this workshop, we assume that you have little to no experience with Google Earth Engine. So this is targeted towards beginners who have had little experience. And as you guys have seen from the introduction email from Dr. Casey, we provided a link to the Google Earth Engine sign-up page. And so very briefly in our introduction, we'll talk about what is Google Earth Engine and how to set up. Here I provide a link to the introductory video, which you can watch after. And basically, Google Earth Engine is a geospatial processing and analysis platform. One thing to note that instead of doing the processing on your computer, it's doing it on the cloud. I think for environmental epidemiologists, Google Earth Engine can sort of become a one-stop shop for a lot of environmental remote sensing product. And furthermore, it is free for non-commercial purposes. To sign up for your account, you can visit this link. And when you do use Google Earth Engine, the link to do it is through this code editor as linked here. Many of you may have already visited the sign up page. You simply have to provide your email. Most of the time would provide my institutional email. I would like to note that it's probably more convenient if you provide an email that's connected to a Google account, because you can then easily save your data to your Google Drive. And just very briefly, this is what the code editor looks like. Hari will be talking more to you about the code editor. And finally, I'm just after Hari takes over the screen, I'm going to share the link to the webinar materials in the chat box. As well, you can access, once you have access to Google Earth Engine, you can access the code that we'll show today through this link. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Hari, and he'll talk to you and introduce Google Earth Engine to you.
Okay, thanks so much, Kelvin, and thanks to you all for being here. I'm actually really excited that I'm the person who gets to show this thing off. I think it's going to save a lot of you a lot of time. So what I'm going to do is just basically dive right in. So we're going to play around with the code editor. I'm going to show you how to search for things, how to navigate this platform, and then just run a very brief script to show you what it can do. So it's a Google product, so we have to start with search. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to type in the normalized difference vegetation index. This is a common measure, satellite measure that we use to measure green space. And so what we see is when I just type that in, I get a number of hits of different satellite products that can be used to study this. So I'm going to just click one that I've worked with before. And so this is, we get some information on the satellite product. So this is from the MODIS satellite data set. We see that it's a 16-day measure, and it has 250-meter resolution. And so obviously the sort of time period can be very important for us when we're thinking about the environmental epidemiology studies we're conducting. And that's right there front and center, making it really easy to find that information. The other thing that we might care about is when data collection started and stopped for this satellite product. And so we can see right here that this has been collected since February 2000 and is pretty up to date. Looks like the last image was recorded in August of 2020. And so that's that's some nice information again, very important for us for our research that again is so easy to retrieve. We may also want to sort of read up a bit more about this product, and so they have links to the dataset provider. And so, you know, for our methods section, we might want a bit more detail on how exactly these satellite images were collected. The other thing to look at when you're investigating this are these bands, and so you can think of these as essentially variables that are linked to the cells in your raster data file, in this image file from the satellite. And so you see that NDVI is actually just one of many different attributes that we might want to look at for the research that we're doing. And again, it makes it really easy to find all that information just in this little table here. There's also some additional pieces about terms of use. We don't want to violate those. And then more details about citing the data in some of our research. So that's NDVI, but some of us might be interested in other things. So, you know, we can look at air pollution. And we see that there are some products. It looks like this is a Sentinel satellite. And so when I open that up, we again get a lot of details about what information is collected in this raster file. We're not going to have time to go through this in too much detail, but there's a ton of information here. I think that's kind of the point that we're trying to make. The data set availability for these air pollution data sets is a little bit more recent. So this looks like it only started in 2018, but that still might be useful for some of the work that you might be thinking about doing. And the other thing is this is available for the entire globe. Right, so this is not just an American data set. And so if there's colleagues working in different parts of the world, this is a really powerful ability to get some information about some of these places that you might be working in. So I guess I won't beat a dead horse here, but you can search for pretty much if there's any exposure that you're thinking about. Definitely worth just typing it into the search window and seeing if something pops up before you start digging. And I think I'll leave that there. So now that we've talked about search, let's talk a little bit more about actually using this interface. And so this tab here on the left is kind of provides you a lot of resources when you're first starting to write code. And so the language that's used here is JavaScript, which some of us may be familiar with, some of us may not be familiar with. But regardless, as we start to compile programs, you'll see here, this is kind of my directory. And so I've saved a number of different files. I've created some folders for various things. And so you can sort of organize your files that way. You can also create your own repositories. And so this is an example of one I did for another workshop. And so you can sort of organize your files in that way to make it easier to share with other people. This reader tab is showing you some examples of other users as repositories that I've kind of read into my home directory so I can access it for my work. The other important thing that's nice to kind of think about here is if we're first starting out, it might be helpful for us to have some examples to work with. And so if I just click this normalized difference example and run it, this sort of gives me an idea of what exactly, this very simple program is doing. I can get some insight into what different functions are available, and I can sort of get an understanding of how to do some of these things. So this is like kind of making a map. If I wanted to better understand what this function is doing, I can actually move over to the docs tab. And so the docs tab is actually a data dictionary for all of Earth Engine's functions. And so this ee.image function, I can look it up in the docs tab. So I see this bar here, and then I can click ee.image, and boom, it gives me some information. So this is basically referring to an object in JavaScript that Earth Engine is using to refer to a single raster image. And I get some information about the syntax and how to use it. And so I imagine that for many new users, this will be a place to spend a lot of time as you're first reading new scripts and starting to kind of integrate it into your work. The final tab here is the Assets tab. And so Earth Engine predominantly stores raster image files. I think they are beginning to include some vector-based images, things like census and administrative boundary files. But we may want to upload our own files. We may already be working with them. It's processed in a way that we understand. We obviously need to be very careful here. We don't want to upload anything that's HIPAA protected or any protected information, of course. But for something like a census database that's from a year that's much earlier, this might be a way for you to upload it and be able to leverage some of the computational power and some of the processing algorithms that Earth Engine has built in. So now that we've kind of talked about this, I'm going to now shift to the script that I'd written and that Kelvin, I think, has shared with all of you. I think what I'm going to do is, again, at a very high level, talk through what this is doing. We're not going to go line by line in the code because we don't have time, but I encourage you to refer to it if you have questions and as you start to learn. So what I'm doing here is I've just hit run on this script, and you see two things are happening. One is I get this time series plot of different values of NDVI, and then I'm getting this map that's appearing here at the bottom. So the way to kind of unpack this is in our epi studies, we often care a lot about the space, the geographic extent that we're looking in, and we want to do some descriptive analysis to make sure that this database and the data that we're using actually corresponds to what we think it should be. And so this just provides an example of how these descriptive analyses are super easy to do. So back in, a year ago when we were thinking about this, we thought we were all going to be in Washington, D.C. So I used this polygon tool to draw a box around Washington, D.C. to define my geographic extent. And this line 9, that's basically just kind of translated my box into a polygon object. And so you can imagine this is super powerful, right? You can draw this in any shape you want to refer to any geography you want. You could draw it around this country to get a bigger buffer size, etc. And so that's a very nice and useful, easy, intuitive tool that allows us to set our geographic boundaries. Next, what I'm doing is I'm just going to reassign that geometry file to a region, a place that I'll use for the rest of my analysis. Secondly, we have to think about the satellite product. And so what I'm doing here is I'm pulling in Landsat 8 NDVI data. And Google refers to that entire satellite image collection as image collection. So what that's doing is it's basically sending me to a database that has every one of those satellite images in Landsat 8. That's kind of crazy because there's a lot of data there. So what I might want to do is filter the time period there that might more closely align to my project. I've just picked January 2013, which I think is the start of data collection in that satellite. And then I've specified a date range where I just am kind of saying increment this by a year. So I'm basically going to ask it for every raster image from January 2013 to 6 years later. This is a nice way to write it because we, as you'll see, it makes it easy for us to manipulate the time period that we might care about. And then we have to filter that entire image collection to just the images in the date range that we've specified. We also would for this analysis, we just want the NDVI data. As we saw, there may be a number of other bands that we don't necessarily care as much about. So we're just going to restrict the data that we're going to be looking at to NDVI alone here. And then in this line 55 to 64, this is just making us our time series plot. And so the output is going to appear here. Console, when you're first starting to work with this, you may see a lot of red, unfortunately. And so that's kind of sign that we may need to check what we've written. Fortunately, things seem to be working. And as you can see, we have this plot that shows us each of these points is corresponding to one raster image. NDVI is high in the summer, low in the winter, so that checks out. And then we can sort of move on to making this map below. And so by that, I'm sort of telling Earth Engine to just pull the NDVI data over this entire time range that just corresponds to that box around Washington, DC. And so we may, maybe we don't want an average over that entire period. And so what's nice is then I can just go up to where I specified that date range, and I can say, maybe I don't want 6 years, maybe I want 6 months. And then if I run that, it's very easy for me to update. The time series obviously is much smaller, but this green space, obviously this map looks very different because it's only looking now at a much smaller set of images. Finally, we referred to this point before that we can't necessarily upload patient data here. So it can be useful for us to export these raster image files to some local drive for us to do our epi analyses. And so in line 87, this is just showing you some code to export the raster that you've sort of processed in Earth Engine to your Google Drive folder. And so that's an important point. It's not kind of a download thing that's just gonna click directly. It first will store it in your Google Drive, but you can kind of tell it where to store it, and then you can download it from there. And so you can change your coordinate reference system if you need it. You may have to play around with the pixels if it's a very large image. Sometimes you may run into size limits in the export. But there's a lot of kind of resources that you can look at for that. So that was a whirlwind, but hopefully you have a little bit better understanding now about how to search for things, some intuition about how the scripts and the docs and the assets work, and so kind of how to navigate a simple program. I'm going to now pass it back to Kelvin, who's going to show you how to do some more sophisticated processing.
All right, thank you very much, Hari. So in this section, I'll dive a little bit deeper into the basic functionalities of Google Earth Engine. I'll first talk about shapefiles, and then talk about zonal statistics, focus statistics, as well as some additional tools. So for those of you who have used ArcGIS or other GIS programs on your computer before, you may know shapefiles as a map layer of predefined polygons or shapes. One of the examples of shapes that's commonly used for environmental epidemiologists in the United States are a layer of census tracts. So on the left here, you see an example of the census tracts around the Washington, DC area, with the red census tract indicating the Milken Institute School of Public Health, where we would have been for our ISE 2020 conference. So just briefly going into the code, how I did this was to first set the map center to the Milken Institute School of Public Health. I then loaded the US Census tracts here by defining tract data and gathering the feature collection called a Tiger Tracts TP1. As Hari had mentioned, you can easily search places and data sets and be able to find a string. Then, in order to filter the total census tracts into that are only in the DC area, use functions called filter bounds, and then I filtered it so that the state FIPS code was 11, and keep in mind that 11 is the District of Columbia's FIPS code. And then finally, to only identify the tract for the Milken Institute School of Public Health, and then filter the bounds to the EE geometry point, indicating the center of the Milken Institute School of Public Health. To visualize your feature collections, or in this case, the census tracts around the Washington, DC area, you simply ask Google Earth Engine to add layers. You can add, in this case, the DC tracts as gray, and then adding this layer for only the tract that's in for the Milken School of Public Health as red. And then finally, we can also download not only raster data into our Google Drive, we could export these data with the with the DC census tracts as a table and call it ISE DC census tracts. We can download it as CSV or any other shapefile or KML. So one thing to actually keep in mind for when you're working with the Google Earth Engine editor is that when you press run on here, it runs the entire script. So it will go through it won't, once if it encounters an error anywhere in the script, it's going to stop. So when you click run for this, it will identify that on this here, that there's a task to be completed. And that task is to export the DC census tracts onto your Google Drive. So here, once you go to a task tab and you click run, you can then select where you want to save it in your Google Drive. I'm gonna just call it ISE 2020. And then you can select a file format or other shapefile formats for you to save it in. So I'm not gonna do that here, but this is how you run certain tasks, especially things like exporting on Google Earth Engine. So as I already mentioned, you can also upload your shapefiles under the Assets tab. And this is found under the Assets tab on the left. You can click New and Table Upload and select shapefiles. This is because not all the shapefiles that you might want are going to be on Google Earth Engine. I've shown that you could find the census tract shapefiles, but there may be other specified geographies that you might want to upload. Here just gave some specifics about what the shapefile needs to be uploaded with, and also if you do upload a zip file with all your shapefiles, it would need to contain shapefile as well as the database file, projection, etc. This again becomes what's called an asset, your personal asset on Google Earth Engine. And those assets can be then imported into your code. I'm now going to touch a little bit on zonal statistics. So what this refers to is given a certain predefined zone or area, such as a census tract. In this example, this shape is a triangle. What if we wanted to calculate from a raster, such as this, a grid of pixels, the average value of a measurement, in this case, for example, NDVI. So what if we wanted to calculate for this shape, the average or the weighted average of all these values for the triangle? How would you do this in Google Earth Engine? In the same vein, what if you want to calculate other things like summary statistics, median, maximum, minimum, etc. And also, the script I'm going to show will direct you to how you could download these to use with other programs. So here, similar to the shapefile example that I used, I first set the map center to the American Institute of Public Health. I loaded the tract data as I did in the previous example. And to contrast what Hari was doing with the Landsat L8 data, in this example, I instead chose to use the MODIS data and selecting NDVI from it. And I defined the start and end dates to be enclosing in June 2020. Here is just a brief statement about getting the mean of the temporal mean of NDVI for June 2020. So in order to calculate the mean for the Milken census tract, what we use then is something called a reducer. In other words, taking the raster pixels and reducing it into the mean of the shape. You can see briefly here, I defined, let's use the reducer mean, the mean reducer, and the geometry that I want to use is only the Milken census tract. The scale, for those of you who used MODIS before, it's 250 meters. And this is just briefly defining the maximum of pixels that you would want to consider. here I added a statement that said print the mean NDVI for Milken for June 2020. And you'll find this in the console. Here it shows that the NDVI is 3,667. Now, in Google Earth Engine, the raw data that they get from MODIS is scaled by 10,000. So this is equivalent to around 0.37 NDVI. I added some snippets in the code here where you could try calculating a different summary measure of NDVI for Milken census tract. And now, what if you wanted to, for example, calculate the NDVI, mean NDVI for all the shapes, all the census tracts in the DC area? For this, you use a very, very similar syntax as we did for the one means census tract for Milken. Instead, wrap that around a function. I just call this add NDVI and throw this reducer as part of it. And then, similar to some other programs, what you can use is multiply apply that function to all the shapes in the DC area. And finally, in the last statement, here I exported this to my Google Drive, and I downloaded it. So what you'll see after you download these data is then you can explore it in the program of your choice. Here I just showed what it would look like in Microsoft Excel. The GeoID10 identifies the different tracks in the DC area, and then the unscaled NDVI. Last thing that I'll touch on is focus statistics. So when we don't have things, we want to pre-process the raster files, or maybe if you have point data, you may want to instead not use predefined shapes, but do something like taking the a point and then calculating a buffer around it. As well, you might want to pre-process your raster data instead of taking the mean. Maybe for this example here, maybe want to take the maximum of this this number of pixels around a buffer, around a point. So Google Earth Engine also has many functions where you could do this. And here I just showed some of the examples. I set the center of this map and also showed the point shown in black here as the center of Milken Institute School of Public Health. Briefly here, I defined the point to be 500 meters around Milken. And then, similar to the last example, I imported the NDVI data set, the MODIS NDVI data set for June of 2020. And I visualized the pixels that are around that area. So what you can see is these 250 meter times 250 meter pixels around Milken School of Public Health. So what are some of the things that you can do? One thing that you can do is define a kernel around each area to pre-process your rasters. And in this case, I defined a kernel that's a square, and it's a 250 meter times 250 meter kernel. Why might you want to do something like this? For example, if you were studying the effects of greenness on a health outcome or something like a physical activity, you might not be interested in the mean NDVI in the region of the pixels that are around a certain point. You may instead be interested in what is the greenness pixel in a predefined, in this buffer around your point. So in this case, this is what I did. I took a focal maximum and I said that, let's define a square kernel around this point, and then I'm going to pick the maximum pixel of that, that 250 meter buffer. What this allows us to do then is instead of here, this is the raw raster of the mean NDVI in June 2020 of around the Washington, D.C. area. And then when we process it, what we get to pick the focal maximum is we get something that looks a lot greener because it's going around to pick, going around every 250 meters of each pixel and then picking the highest observation. So again, you can clip these and do other different functions of it, as well as to download it and work with it on your own computer, or even do all this pre-processing on Google Earth Engine. As it will become clear, there are many, many other tools that you could use. And Hari has introduced us that you can just search, go to the search bar and use it, find many of these tools, as well as the Documents tab and the different examples around the internet will also help you with the specific analysis that you need. The code editor also allows you to customize or create your tools. So with that brief three examples, I'm going to pass it over to Peter to talk about some of the implications of using Google Earth Engine in our environmental epidemiology work.
Great. All right, Kelvin, thanks so much. So I think, can you guys see my slides? Looks good. All right. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about kind of overview of Google Earth Engine as a resource to retrieve, process, analyze, and download unprecedented amounts of spatial data. I'll talk a little bit about how to link these spatial data to health information for epi analyses, so kind of taking it from the cloud and actually applying it to some of our epi data. Then I'll talk, and I think there's been some questions in the chat already about kind of ethical and logistical concerns with interacting with Google Earth Engine, and that's a really serious thing to think about. And then I'll talk kind of an example of thoughts on how to effectively incorporate GEE into your kind of environmental epi pipeline in terms of how we've chosen to do that. Now, we don't have all the answers, but we're going to talk about what we've done, and we're happy to have a discussion about how to do this effectively. So first of all, I think Hari and Kelvin have really captured a lot of the utility of what Google Earth Engine can kind of bring to your analyses in terms of all this access to massive amounts of spatial data. And actually more is being added every day. So it really is an incredible resource to sift through, to find, process, and download massive amounts of spatial data that have been available to us, but they've just been really, really difficult to kind of obtain and work with in the past. So this is an incredible resource. But how do you actually use these data for your actual epidemiologic research? And that's, we really need to link these spatial data to health information. The computing power of Google Earth Engine is super enticing. But I think it was mentioned this is one-stop shopping. Is it really completely one-stop shopping? Perhaps not. And let's talk, I'll give a very brief example of kind of how we do this. And I think many of you have cohorts similar to the Nurses' Health Study. This is a cohort in the US, 120,000 female nurses live throughout the US. And we geocoded all their home addresses, right? So we have all this information, this potentially identifiable information on our participants, right? We also have all sorts of health data on them. And we might want to link it to, as was mentioned, this greenness data, NDVI from MODIS satellites, right? So how do we go about doing that? We have to take our addresses and we have to somehow extract the value for a pixel to their addresses. And then we can kind of say we have an exposure metric. We can do our epi analyses. But there's some big ethical and logistical concerns here, right? So we talked about assets. When you upload something to Google Earth Engine, it becomes an asset. But who is this an asset for, right? I mean, when you upload data, anyone can access your data on Google Earth Engine from there on out, right? So you really have to think about what you're going to upload. We cannot upload participant geocoded address data to Google Earth Engine, right? This is protected health information. Especially you can't send address information and health information up to Google Earth Engine. You need a data use agreement. We haven't actually worked that out with Google, but I think that would probably be, for most studies, a no-no. So really, really have to be careful about what you upload. And then more than just participant geocoded address data, you have to be careful about uploading other spatial data. So for instance, if you developed, let's say you spent your entire dissertation working on an air pollution model, and you upload that to Google Earth Engine, right? Everyone who searches like Hari did for air pollution, if you've put in a keyword for air pollution, they might find your air pollution model, and they'll be able to use it without citing you, without maybe using it properly. So you really need to think about what you're uploading to Google Earth Engine, and really be thoughtful about that, as opposed to just kind of using this computing power without considering it. So, and then we talked about these spatial data sets and how amazing they are as resources, but they're also usually massive, right? We're talking about Landsat data, 30-meter data collected every 16 to 32 days for the entire globe. This is a massive amount of data. So downloading can be, take a lot of time and hard drive space. You may remember how Kelvin kind of went over to his task console, and there was that he can click run to download the image. So if you were going to download many images, going through that process may be really time consuming, and then also might just swamp your hard drive, right? Your servers might just be overwhelmed by the amount of data. So, what do we do? How have we kind of created a pipeline for using Google Earth Engine in our research? So what we do is we actually acquire and process our chosen spatial data sets in Google Earth Engine. So let's say it's Landsat data. We will pick the extent that we want our Landsat data. We'll process it in Google Earth Engine. So we'll think about all the time periods we want, all the locations we want, and then the different types of processes we want. So for instance, focal statistics. Let's say we had 30-meter Landsat data, but we wanted different buffer sizes, 90 meters, 150 meters, et cetera. So we can actually do that processing in Google Earth Engine much faster than we can do on our desktop computers or on our server. So that's an amazing resource. And then we set up an automated script to download these data sets to Google Drive. So instead of going through and clicking each one, there are ways to automate that. And then you can also set up backup and sync using this program from Google that will sync the actual data from Google Drive to your local study server. So you're not having to go to Google Drive and download because again, these can be many gigabytes, terabytes of data. And then ultimately we link our protected health information to our Google Earth Engine data on our local server. So we're not pushing our data up to the cloud, but we're really bringing the data down from the cloud. But there's big limitations in terms of disk space and local processing power. So it's not a perfect process, but I think as was mentioned in the chat, we do need to consider what we do with our data, our assets in terms of interacting with Google Earth Engine. So in conclusion, I think that Hari and Kelvin have demonstrated that Google Earth Engine is an incredible resource to efficiently search for, acquire, process, and analyze massive amounts of spatial data from around the globe. These tools are really free and easy to use with some practice, I think. Hari talked about all these example codes, and the reader, you can see other people's code. So, and with literally just some Googling for how other people have done things, you are almost always able to find an example of how somebody else has pulled, maybe they've worked with a different data set, but they've done a process similar to what you want to achieve. So I think this is a really easy to use resource for anyone who has some experience with coding. But the caveat is the ethics of using protected health information with Google Earth Engine data must be thoughtfully considered. And the logistical burden of using Google Earth Engine on your local servers may also be limiting. So you really need to think through, it'd be great, yes, to download all the Landsat data there ever was on the entire globe. But that probably isn't the best use of your resources. So you need to also be thoughtful about what data you're bringing down from the server. I mean, the beauty is that it's in the cloud, so you can do a lot of processing there, and then when you're kind of close to your final metrics, you can bring those down. And I think in the end, these challenges can be overcome. And we think that Google Earth Engine is really a crucial tool for efficient and innovative environmental epi research. So I think with that, thank you for listening. I think we've left actually 20 minutes for questions. Feel free to email us. As we said, that there's a Dropbox link, so you'll have access to all our code. We've gone through this really fast just to try and give you a taste of a lot of different things, but I know we haven't explained what every line of code is, but Hari and Kelvin have annotated things really nicely. So if you have any questions, email us. You've got our Twitter info there too, so you can follow us or direct message us, whatever you want. But we really look forward to hearing from you guys now. We have 20 minutes. Joan, do you want to state anything, or just open it up to questions?
I'll just help out with fielding these questions to you guys. Yeah, and just for folks that weren't here earlier, this is being recorded. It will be uploaded to ISCE Global's YouTube channel later this week, so you can get it there, and we'll also make sure you have the link to the posted code. So, okay, so yeah, that was fun. I'm semi-convinced that this is worth all the effort to learn how to use this new tool. So questions from the audience. So first of all, can you talk about different ways to summarize data over time? People average data in over different periods, but is there a different way that people often are summarizing data from an image over time?
Hi, and this is Jennifer. I'm the person that asked that question, and I was specifically asking with respect to the satellite raster images. I understand, looking at different summary statistics within a shape, but when you were using a few years worth of a satellite image over time, are people usually just averaging those pixels, or is there some other typical summary statistic that's used?
I'll take a shot at this. I mean, I think it really depends on your research question, right? So that there's unfortunately, not one size fits all. But I think if you're, for instance, if you think about green space, we talked about NDVI in our examples, right? So if you think there's some sort of seasonal average that you care about, maybe a 3-month period is sufficient to average, but maybe an annual average wouldn't make sense. I'm not sure if that addresses your question, but I think this certainly, if you think about air pollution data, maybe you don't want to average over a time period. So I don't know, Hari, Kelvin, any other thoughts?
Yeah. I would like to add that especially for satellite remote sensing data, because it is an image taken from space, there are the raw data has quality assurance strings that are attached, which will tell you whether or not it's taken during a cloud-free day, how much confidence the instrument had in that image. So what I've seen from people who have average or are taking a look at large timescales, what they tend to do is use these quality assurance measures to try to pick the best images of that year or during a season and so forth. So they're using that to summarize the data or condense long periods of time into more static images.
Okay. And I think also there are algorithms to choose the best quality image in a certain data period that are built into Google Earth Engine. So that's another resource.
Great. Joel Schwartz is asking if, in addition to census tract shapefiles, are data behind those census tracts available on Google Earth Engine?
Yeah, I'll take that. It's I just did a brief search. From what I can see, only the shapefiles for census blocks and zip codes and different roads and stuff are available on Google Earth Engine as of now. I'm sure someone will be uploading them, and eventually it goes through a process by Google to then make those available. So at this time, it's not available as far as I know.
Okay,
I will put in a plug for other things, like there's NHGIS, where you can download census data with all, the shapefiles with all the census actual data attached to it as well. It's pretty easy to interact with if it's another webinar, but certainly a useful resource.
Yeah, and a plug for NHGIS as well. They have the crosswalked files if you're doing longitudinal analyses that will estimate census characteristics within the same boundaries over time to make your life much easier. So yes, if you're not familiar with that site, definitely check it out as well. Okay, so then a few people are asking about the reduce.neighbor function. So I'm not sure where that came up, but a couple of people have asked about it. So can we just go over what reduce.neighbor does? And there was a follow-up related to it, but we could start with that and I'll find the follow-up.
Hari, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, and I mean, I know you use this too. I also was doing some Googling as those questions came in. My understanding is you know, it is worth like familiarizing yourself with the documentation. And unfortunately, the words that Google uses sometimes to refer to these things aren't necessarily intuitive to us who've used these words in very different contexts. But from what I was able to gather, reduced neighborhood is kind of like a focal approach. So it's the neighbor is being used to define a region around a pixel in some way. And so you saw Kelvin use like a square kernel to define, I'm going to search for the pixels in this kind of geometry around my point, and then do something to it, whether it's an average or a maps or what have you. Reduced region, I think, is more sort of like summarizing all of the information in some area. And so they can overlap, like they can get you to the same place in certain cases, but the reduced neighbor, I think, is a little bit more precise. I would think of the reduced neighbor as being more analogous to a focal statistic in a raster, whereas reduced region, I would think of it as more analogous to like a zonal statistic, if you're familiar with that, which is you have a polygon and you're trying to average over everything in that polygon. I don't know, Kelvin, is that kind of how you understand it too?
Yeah, I'm sure I was just searching the documents myself to see if I can give a more technical answer. But yeah, what you said makes sense. I have nothing to add.
There was actually another question about reduced region. Oh, mapping over. So somebody had asked about mapping. Oh yeah, Kelvin, did you want to respond to that? I just brought it up because it was kind of on the topic. But.
Oh yeah, no, you go ahead first.
Okay. So my understanding there is, again, reduced region is like a single, you're doing that once on an area. When you're mapping, that's more useful if you're trying to do something in multiple polygons, like a tract, like Kelvin's tract file. You know, you might want to do something in every one of those tracts. I think that's where is that right? Yeah.
So a question, so the reduce regions command does that already for many tracks at one time. So I was just wondering if it's like computationally faster to map over each using the reduce region and mapping it multiple times, or just using the reduce regions command to do it all at once.
Oh, wow. That's several levels ahead of what I was prepared to answer here. Do you have a...
I would say that computationally, I don't have the statistics behind whether or not mapping a function over many regions or using the reduce regions command is faster or more efficient. However, I would say that the reason why I demonstrate something that maps a function over for many regions is that then people can use that, and you can then customize how you sort of reduce it, and I think then you can customize your tools easier, and it may be more applicable and easier to audit and check over your code.
Okay, thank you.
Great. So there's a question about other languages and how they might interact with Google Earth Engine. So things like Python or R. What does that look like here?
I think it was answered already in the chat, but there is a what is it, RGEE package, I think, in R to interact with Google Earth Engine. And I guess there's a Python API. Thank you to IYER, who I think answered that. But
so, yeah, I'll
Kelvin.
Yeah, I'll briefly talk about that. Yes, so there's it's a very good Python package called it's a Python library called GEE map, and you can actually just go on Twitter. The GEE map creator is very, very good at responding and distributing his work. So there's something called a GEE map, which allows you to use Google Earth Engine through Python. And then someone took this idea, took GEE map, and piped it over to R. And so they wrote an R package on top of GEE map. The reason why we show the raw JavaScript Google Earth Engine console is that it's always probably going to be the most updated, and it's the one that lets you directly interact with Google Earth Engine as well. It probably lowers the demand of your local computer resources. So because all the processing is through a browser and a browser only in Google Earth Engine. It's easier for beginners to get started. But feel free to use RGE in R as well as GEMAP in Python.
Cool. So there's a question about resources to help making the downloading process automatic. And
yep.
A related broader question is, you guys have been Googling how to do things during this webinar, but is Google itself the best resource? Is this on Stack Exchange? Where's the help for using Google Earth Engine generally too?
Well, I'll just speak to the downloading process, making that automatic. I can post something on the Dropbox as well. It's kind of a workaround rather than built into Google's process, but I'll post that. And then, I don't know, what do you guys think? I mean, literally, it's usually Googling, and you find information from a couple different sites. But I think Stack Exchange, you do find pretty consistent, assistance with what you're looking for.
Yeah, I think that's right, Peter. And if I could just add, there is kind of a documentation website that I think is in the slides. It's probably like it's in the reference, where they do walk you through sort of how these different tasks are organized in a more logical, like basically in a very logical way and structured way. I do think it's worth, when you're trying to learn a new function, that probably is the place to look first. And as part of that documentation website, there's a whole tutorials page. And so there they have a bit more geared not towards somebody who's just kind of using this on the fly, but somebody who's like, I want to learn how to use this. And they do have some structured videos that you can watch and exercises that you can follow that I think probably would get more at that. Like, there's going to be we all learn differently. And so some of us with more programming experience, I think probably would be able to, after some work, use Stack Exchange kinds of things to look stuff up. But if you wanted to sort of start from scratch, there are some really nice, more structured training modules on that Google Earth Engine documentation page that I encourage you to look at.
I just echo what Peter and Harry said, because this is a relatively new tool. Google Earth Engine hasn't been around that much. A lot of the documentation and even Google Earth Engine itself is being developed. So there's just going to be, just as with many other computer languages and technical things, these days these things change. And I feel like just Googling something that you want to do scientifically, especially us as environmental epidemiologists, we might not be, we're not spatial temporal data GIS people. It's much easier just to learn the thing that you need to do rather than, at least for me, like going through all the different training might be a better investment of your time to just Google the things that you want to do.
Yeah, so that's kind of related to a question I had, which is, do you guys have a sense of kind of the break point of where it becomes worthwhile to drop QGIS or R or whatever you're using locally and make the move to doing this processing on Google Earth Engine? It sounds like if it's a nationwide study with fine temporal resolution data over many years, then yes, it clearly makes sense. But kind of where's the break-even point that you've gotten a sense of from working with it?
Yeah, I don't know if there's an easy cutoff, but I think the break point is when you realize that trying to process some of your spatial data is just taking days, and also thinking through the types of data, the types of spatial data, right? So if it's I hope we made this clear, but like this is mostly publicly available data gathered by NASA or other satellites. If you need to obtain that data, it's much easier to go through Google Earth Engine than it is to go through, going to NASA's website and trying to download the data. It can be really, really time consuming. I think also these are, many global data sets. So it's worth exploring if you work outside of the US or outside of certain countries where there's not a lot of data availability. It's very easy to go and just search to see if there's data in your area, in your study area, to see if there's resources that you weren't even aware of. I think that's that, there's kind of two ways to think about it. One is that you have a research question, you have your data, and when does it become necessary to increase your processing power? And the other is the kind of exploratory approach where you really can use this tool. We didn't really show it, but you can literally go to any site on the globe, draw a circle, draw a square, and then start looking at data instantly. It's pretty powerful. Yeah,
I just like to add to what Peter was saying. Especially if you're using remote sensing data, that's these satellites are still taking pictures, so they're continuously. Google Earth Engine is continuously updating the data sets. So what I would relate to is instead of having to download these images yourselves onto your server and repeating that process every single time that you want to look at a different region or look at a different time period, it's already on there as a public asset on Google Earth Engine. So I would just need to go there to redefine the time period that I'm looking at and the region that I'm looking at, instead of having to figure out again which swath is this and which satellite I would want to use, and then figure out the intricacies of different NASA APIs for different different APIs for different space agencies. That's all it's kind of like picking your devils. I think there's investment into learning the JavaScript and learning Google Earth Engine, or even learning R or Python packages for using Google Earth Engine. But I think ultimately, if you're going to be using a lot of remote sensing data, especially from satellites, it's worth the break-even point comes pretty early.
Now, the caveat I'll put out there when you're working with any commercial product like this is that they can pull it at any time, right? I mean, that is one of the worries is that this is, I don't think it's a big money maker for them. So if somebody comes in and decides this is not worth their time, we could all have wasted our time learning how to interact with this. But as far as we know, that's not in the horizon. So.
Yeah, Hari, do you want to have anything to add?
No, this is a really good question. And I think this sort of idea that if there's tools you already know how to use and you're able to get by just fine, when is this investment worth it? And I think I'll echo, but kind of emphasize points that have been raised, which is longitudinal data sets where you need to work with multiple rasters is where this, I think, really excels. So I've used it to link data to cancer registry databases for the NDVI metric. And I think this would have been really kind of tedious and painful to just pull those rasters down to be able to link them to the addresses using ArcMap or using some of these other tools. So my workflow is basically Earth Engine to search, process, and then download, and then I typically will do the linkages in R.
Can I add something? I'm a regular user of Google Earth Engine, actually. So my experience is I shifted from traditional software to this because of the amount of data or type of exposure we're thinking. So it's not just one type of exposure. You can do multiple exposure, and it combines all of them together. So if you think about comprehensive measurement of exposure, downloading each of the layer and doing this, stacking them together, it takes ages. So if you want really good exposure profiling with temporal profiling and go spatial variation of exposure, you have to go to a bigger processing power engine, and that's it is. So it's how detailed you want to go and what is your research purpose. So yeah, that's why I shifted from there. But yeah, it's just a way of dealing, the better way of exposure profiling.
Yeah, excellent. I think also people in the chat are mentioning that you need to allow other users to use your spatial data. That may be true. However, Google has access to your spatial data, right? So you no longer have complete control over your spatial data if you upload it. So I think there are certainly ways of checking that box in Google Earth Engine, but you're still basically making your data available to Google.
Fantastic. Okay. I think that we got through everybody's questions in perfect timing. So unless you guys have anything else to add, I will, yeah, so I'll just say thank you very much. Again, we will get this posted, and this was really successful. So thanks for being here and sharing this tool with everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.